Good evening. I'm Hugh Thomas. I'm the director for the Center for the Humanities, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the third book talk of this academic year. We have lots of events, but since we started a little late, I'll let you look at them afterwards, and there's some flyers in the back to pass around. So I'll instead just pass the microphone over to Anne Cruz, who will be introducing tonight's speakers.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for being here. Can you hear me without my holding it, or no? Okay. Thank you so much for being here. It's really a great pleasure and an honor. And I don't think Mihoko would mind if I began with a personal anecdote, which really only has to do with the fact that almost 20 years ago I was hired by the University of Miami to come to the Department of then Foreign Languages and Literatures, and the very first person outside the department who came to greet me was Mihoko Suzuki. And I was so touched by this, not because she wasn't there because of me personally, she was there because Mihoko works on comparative literature and also on feminist literature, and she knew that those were also my interests. And so I do want to thank her here tonight for being there 20 years ago when I first arrived. So thank you very much, Mihoko. And like I said, it is a great pleasure, and it's a special honor to present Professor Mihoko Suzuki's impressive new study by the long title of Antigone's Example, Early Modern Women's Political Writing in Times of Civil War, from Christine de Pizan to Helen Maria Williams. In this, her third book, Mihoko Suzuki analyzes the various forms of writing by early modern French and English women who gave voice to their political thought. The scope of her study, from the French Middle Ages to early 19th century England, incorporates 15 women writers, all of whom took an intellectual and ethical stand when faced with the wrenching realities of civic disruption brought on by civil wars, and who also maintained transcultural connections across the English Channel. She shows how Christine de Pizan wrote to the Queen of France lamenting the evils of war, and expands on Pizan's influence across borders. Christine was an Italian and became a cultural transfer between Italy and France, and across time. Pizan's treatise on moral proverbs, for instance, was commissioned to be translated and published by the first Tudor king, Henry VII, and as a requisite work to be read by every manner of men of war. Other women who proffered advice to rulers, such as the English writers Mary Sidney, Elizabeth Cary, and Margaret Cavendish, followed Pizan's footsteps in counseling Elizabeth I against her marriage to the French Duke of Alençon, and to Henrietta Maria, who assumed a prominent role in English civil wars. Similarly, Mihoko selects 4 French women writers, and I'm only going to mention several of the fully 15 women that she writes about. Françoise de Motteville, the Duchess of Montpensier, the Duchess of Longueville, and the Duchess of Nemours, as exemplars of women who represented a range of perspectives on the front, the French civil wars between 1648 and 1653 that ultimately failed to check the growing power of royal government. As she discusses these noble women, Mihoko rightly notes that the failure of the Front ironically allowed the Duchess of Montpensier, for instance, to write her memoirs as she was exiled from court. One intriguing aspect of Mihoko's study is her discussion that not only women writers, but French and English royal women, such as Anne of Austria, Henrietta Maria, and Elizabeth Stuart, mediated between the two countries through their letters. These discussions are not curious asides, but are expertly woven into the broader narrative of women's political writings. They evince Mihoko's knowledge and control of the political history of the French and the English courts, and that's no mean feat. Another section of her book that merits special mention is the chapter on Margaret Cavendish's French connection and on Cavendish and the English Civil Wars. As an expert on Cavendish, Mihoko expands on the aristocrat's life and writings, pointing out that because political action was closed to her, Cavendish's prolific writing and publishing on political matters are themselves political interventions. She cites Cavendish's statement, "Nor is it inconsistent with my being a woman to write of wars that was neither between Medes and Persians, Greeks and Trojans, Christians and Turks, but among our own countrymen." Aware of each country's political strife, the women studied in Mihoko's book echo the Greek figure of Antigone in that they follow ethical norms respecting familial duty in their opposition to state power. By Mihoko's choice of the conflicted and conflictive Antigone, the woman who defies the law in order to bury a brother killed by another brother in civil war, the tragic heroine becomes an important model for women political writers, even as each one appropriates the female paragon to her own purpose. When considering Mihoko's new book with her two earlier works, what stood out for me was her clear development of thought, what in Spanish is called the hilo conductor, or guiding theme, that illuminates the understudied role of women in their unrelenting challenge to war. Mihoko's three books, and again, this is what I think. Mihoko's three books comprise a trilogy that spans a feminist and comparatist reading of women's incursions in national and international political strife, whether as literary characters in male-authored texts or as historical actors themselves in times of civil war. It is therefore not coincidental that Mihoko's first book focused on another mythological female figure that served as archetype, that of Helen of Troy, in the Metamorphoses of Helen, Authority, Difference, and the Epic. Mihoko takes up what is considered to be the most masculine of literary genres, since it deals with men at war. We do not forget that the first Greek epic, Homer's Iliad, begins in the middle of the Trojan War. Not only the Iliad, but the Odyssey, as well as Virgil's Aeneid, Spenser's Faerie Queen, and Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, and Antony and Cleopatra, are studied with the purpose of understanding how Helen shadows their women protagonists as a figure of mutability and difference. In this book, Mihoko reads the figure of Helen as a woman who is both sacrificed and scapegoated, yet who embodies the thread of the female other in the various surrogates that appear in later epic poetry. Mihoko's first book that thus examined the tradition of epic from the perspective of the representation of women within a literary framework. Her second book, Subordinate Subjects, Gender, the Political Nation and Literary Form in England, expanded her area of study to those subordinate subjects, such as apprentices, and in particular, historical women, who responded subversively to early modern English politics through both literary and non-literary writings. What brilliantly follows in her third book, the one we're talking about tonight, is a historical revision of how political discourse became gendered and challenged both contemporary theorists and modern philosophers to show how women's political writings were enabled by England's and France's civil wars. These transgressions signified a breach in national politics that would no longer suffer gender exclusion. In her superb summation, Mihoko makes evident that Antigone's defiance as both protagonist and hero of war's tragedy vindicates Helen's sacrifice and subservience, and by extension, those of early modern women, who overturn gender hierarchy and assert women's political independence. Now, of course, these three books can all be read separately, and I invite you to select your favorite. But for tonight, we are celebrating the third book in the trilogy, and I'd like to therefore ask Professor Suzuki to give her own views on its making. You're welcome.
You said it was going to be short. Thank you so much, Anne. That was an amazingly generous introduction, and I really appreciate it. I thought you were going to talk about our teaching together, which was a little more fraught, but still enjoyable, right? And thank you, Hugh, for inviting me to present my book tonight. And it's a great honor to be here. And thank you, Christina and Oni, for their help in making it happen. I also want to thank the many members in this audience who provided a supportive community in which this project took shape. As Anne already has detailed so well, this book, Antigone's Example, arose out of my previous book, Subordinate Subjects, which focused on the political activity and writings of women and non-aristocratic men leading up to the English Civil Wars in the middle decades of the 17th century and its aftermath, concluding in the establishment of the constitutional monarchy in 1688. France also experienced a civil war during the mid-17th century in which women played a prominent role, and so I began Antigone's Example by extending my focus to France as well as to England, and to the relationship between the political and literary culture of these two nations. From there, my investigations uncovered a canon of women's Civil War writings in France and England that extended back to the early 15th century and forward to the early 19th century, leading me to conclude that there was a close relationship between women's political writing and the Civil War context in which they lived. The book's title, of course, refers to the classical Greek heroine in Sophocles' tragedy, who becomes heir to Oedipus when her two brothers have killed each other in civil war. In disobeying her uncle Creon, the ruler of Thebes, who prohibits the burial of her brother Polynices, Antigone follows ethical norms that are opposed to state power, thereby emerging as the protagonist of the tragedy. Taking Antigone as a point of departure, I suggest that civil war, by disrupting political and social order, constitutes an enabling condition for women's rejection of a subordinate position in the family as well as in civil society. Civil war thereby makes possible their intervention in the masculine reserve of politics through the public form of political thought and writing. Women writers living during times of civil wars, Christine de Pizan from the early 15th century to Germaine de Stael and Helen Maria Williams, active during and after the French Revolution in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, transgressed their allotted position to write about political matters. In doing so, they disobeyed the dominant ideology and the culturally sanctioned injunctions against women's involvement in politics. I'm interested in shedding light on both the historical specificity of the political writings of these writers and the transhistorical context of civil war, to suggest that this context enables women to overcome cultural injunctions against their participation in political discourse and contribution to political thought. In doing so, I seek to revise the history of European political thought, which has been comprised of political treatises. To cite a prominent and familiar example, Machiavelli's The Prince. My earliest example, Christine de Pizan, did write such treatises, such as the Book of the Body Politic, which was translated into English already in the 16th century and is now included in the Cambridge University Press's series on political thought, along with Machiavelli and other canonical male writers. However, the other writers in my book did not write such treatises, but wrote about politics in a multiplicity of genres, such as poetry, fiction, and drama. In fact, Margaret Cavendish shrewdly expressed her own political views, which differed from her husband's, using the genre of the biography of a husband by his dutiful wife. Moreover, I go beyond much existing work on women's political thought that focuses on their contribution to feminism, the advancement of the rights of women. I suggest instead that women, like their male counterparts, were also invested in questions concerning the polity, for example, the rights and obligations of subjects and sovereigns, and the relationship between private interest and the common good. In constructing a framework for thinking about women in civil war, I have drawn on both classical paradigms and contemporary theory. The French classical scholar Nicole Leroux has written extensively on civil war in ancient Greece as war within the family or household. She also argues that civil war overturns the normal social order, including the conventional hierarchy of men over women, extending her observations to 16th century France, as well as to the civil war in Mozambique from the 1970s to the 1990s. Drawing on Leroux, I suggest that the disruption of social order in civil war enables women to exceed and transgress their assigned role within the family to become protagonists in matters of state. And here I should mention that there exists rich and extensive scholarship in both history and literature on women in civil war, such as Drew Gilpin Faust's work on women's expanded roles during the American Civil War, as well as studies of women in civil war in early modern China during the Ming-Qing transition and Japan during the Warring States period. Sorry. Oops. Okay, here we go. Active during the early 15th century, Christine de Pizan represents the beginning of the European tradition of women's political writing, and it is no accident, I suggest, that she wrote during times of civil war, and civil war permeates her political thought. Her analysis of the causes and consequences of civil war, as well as her advice to her patrons on how to avoid such conflicts, represent the bedrock of her writings. Christine's allegorical representation of France as a mother, whose body is being destroyed by her children, exemplifies an understanding of civil war as war within the family. Her representation of France as a maternal body politic challenges the model of the king's male body politic that is the foundation of Salic law in France, which excluded women as well as their sons from rule. Christine de Pizan's abiding emphasis on civil war in her works arises from her experience of both the times of national unity and prestige during the reign of Charles V, called the Wise, as well as the extended period of internal division and civil war between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs that followed Charles's death. Next slide, please. Just as Christine repeatedly sought to persuade her aristocratic patrons to desist from civil war, so she praises in her book... Next one, yeah. Just as Christine repeatedly sought to persuade her aristocratic patrons to desist from civil war, so she praises in her Book of the City of Ladies the Sabine women who were abducted by Roman men to be their wives and mothers of their children for intervening to avert civil war between their husbands and fathers. In celebrating the sense and virtue of the women who saved the Romans and Sabines from mutual destruction, Christine's account here resonates with the letter she addressed to Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, counseling her to intervene to establish peace between the warring factions within France. Next slide, please. In this image, you can see Christine de Pizan, who served as lady-in-waiting to the Queen, presenting a magnificent collection of her works.
Isn't this it?
No, the one before that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that one. Which she expressly designed, as she did all her manuscripts. Thus, Christine conceived of herself as a political counselor who was not afraid to exhort and even criticize her patrons. She thereby follows in the tradition Michel Foucault identified of counselors speaking truth to rulers, as opposed to flattering them, as an important aspect of the history of political thought. In fact, her ability as counselor was widely recognized by her contemporaries. Her renown that extended beyond France led the Duke of Milan, Gian Galeazzo Visconti, and the English king, Henry IV, to invite her to their courts to act as counselor. Indeed, Christine's The Book of Deeds of Arms and of Chivalry, I think that's the next slide, yes, on military practices was translated into English at the command of Henry VII, who required the book to be read by his nobility. And here you can see Christine being taught by Minerva as she's writing her book. You know, Minerva is the god of war, as you know. In addition, next slide please, she dedicated the Book of Peace, the first book on peace theory, to the French heir, Louis de Guyenne. And here she's presenting that book to him. This book was recently acquired by the University of Toronto Libraries. I also argue that Machiavelli was influenced by Christine de Pizan. Machiavelli aspired to be a political counselor like Christine, as evidenced in his most well-known work, The Prince. He traveled to France on 4 diplomatic missions, each lasting 3 to 6 months, and admired France unified under Charles V as a political example for Italy. He wrote The Prince and the Discourses shortly after his return from the last of these missions. I provide several pages of evidence, including Machiavelli's use of genres that Christine deployed, their shared interest in promoting the common good, as well as verbal echoes. For example, Christine states, "Fortune is good to the bold," anticipating Machiavelli's well-known statement in The Prince, "Being a woman, fortune favors young men because they are less circumspect and ardent, and because they command her with greater audacity." To take another striking example, Christine states, "Since there is never any love without fear, whereas there is often fear without love, it is better for a prince to be loved than feared." Machiavelli echoes and inverts this statement in a well-known passage in The Prince. It is far better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. Although Machiavelli has largely been considered as a completely original theorist, and it has hitherto been unfathomable that he would have been influenced by a female political thinker, I argue that uncovering his engagement with Christine complicates his apparent misogyny, at least in his political works, and highlights the importance of attending to intellectual genealogies that are not always straightforward or acknowledged. In fact, Christine herself accurately predicted the influential afterlife of her writings. She expressed her ambition of her works to reach a wider future readership as political analysis, even though her political counsel did not lead to the cessation of civil war in her own time. And I quote, "But in future times, this book will, if it please God, be disseminated and read in many places, since books are, as it were, perpetual in the world, in virtue of the many copies which are commonly made." This statement is remarkable in her self-confident assessment of the importance of her works, especially since the dissemination of her works of which she speaks was through the medium of manuscript copies, since she was writing before the advent of print. The limited time I have does not allow me to discuss each of the authors that I take up in my book, which includes well-known authors such as Mary Sidney and Aphra Behn, as well as many lesser-known ones. I will now turn to an example from the middle of the book, Margaret Cavendish, who wrote during the English Civil Wars in the mid-17th century, between the forces of the monarch, Charles I, and that of the Parliament. Cavendish accompanied Charles's French queen, Henrietta Maria, in exile to France, where she met her husband William Cavendish, Duke of Newcastle, one of Charles's foremost generals. William was exiled in France after his defeat that marked Parliament's victory against the Royalists. Cavendish's sojourn in France overlapped with the Fronde, the civil war between the regency of Anne of Austria during Louis XIV minority on the one hand, and the judicial courts and the aristocracy on the other. Slide, please. Back again. Yeah, wait. Yeah, this one. So this portrait of Anne was one that stayed in Louis XIV's apartments after her death. You know, he really liked the portrait. And the medal is Anne and Louis XIV as a young boy. Anne of Austria's regency produced works that celebrated women's political agency. Next slide, please. Such as a collection, no, the one before that. Whoops. That one, I'm sorry. They're out of order. Such as a collection featuring heroic women, such as the biblical Judith, who beheaded Israel's enemy Holofernes and Joan of Arc. The left-hand image is the frontispiece to this book, depicting Anne of Austria's statue. You can see that Cavendish modeled one of her own frontispieces after this representation of Anne by portraying herself as a statue in a niche with her arm akimbo, just like Anne's. As a member, I guess it's the one, it's the Montpensier slide. Yes, this one, thank you. As a member of Henrietta Maria's court, Cavendish also had the opportunity to meet female aristocrats such as Henrietta Maria's niece and Louis XIV's cousin, Anne-Marie Louise d'Orléans, Duchess of Montpensier, whose military exploits were celebrated in popular pamphlets and who later recounted these activities in her memoirs. Her portrait, which she commissioned, which you see on the slide, depicts her as the goddess Diana holding a shield and spear. In addition, Cavendish's works provide evidence that she modeled herself after Christine de Pizan in writing as a political counselor, both to her husband and to Charles II, the son of Charles I, who was restored to the throne in 1660. While Christine influenced Machiavelli, as I argue, many of the writers I discuss in my book, including Cavendish, engaged energetically with Machiavelli's political thought, providing evidence of their self-consciousness as political theorists. For example, Cavendish describes Elizabeth I's rule by referring to Machiavelli's coupling of the lion and the fox in The Prince, and his recommendation to rulers of the art of dissimulation. And I quote, "Queen Elizabeth reigned long and happy, and though she clothed herself in a sheep's skin, yet she had a lion's paw and a fox's head. She strokes the cheeks of her subjects with flattery, whilst she picks their purses, and though she seemed loath, yet she never failed to crush to death those that disturbed her ways." By depicting the universally revered monarch in such a manner, she challenges the general condemnation of Machiavellian statecraft. For the reader must either condemn Elizabeth in following Machiavelli or reevaluate Machiavelli in light of her successful reign. Moreover, this rather disturbing portrait is closer to recent assessments of Elizabeth that she jealously guarded her prerogative and adroitly manipulated Parliament with her masterful rhetoric. However, unlike Machiavelli and other male political theorists such as Thomas Hobbes, author of The Leviathan, whom Cavendish knew as part of her husband's intellectual circle, Cavendish avoided the form of a political treatise. Because Cavendish and other writers I discuss wrote concerning politics in various unexpected forms, such as plays and poetry, next slide, they have not been recognized, the one after that, thank you, as part of the predominantly male tradition of political theorists. Yet, by avoiding the single-voiced form of the treatise and writing in these multi-voice genres, I suggest that Cavendish was able to present her political position, which diverged in important ways from her husband's, in an indirect manner, thus avoiding an overt challenge to her his unequivocal royalism. I'm going to conclude my presentation by turning now to two women who wrote in the context of the French Revolution, which I take to be another instance of civil war at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. Germaine de Staël and Helen Maria Williams both supported the principles of the French Revolution, but wrote against the Reign of Terror, which they considered in its excess and violence to have departed from those initial principles. Next slide, please. For example, Staël wrote anonymously, though labeling the work as authored by a woman, Reflections on the Trial of the Queen, which advanced a position against Marie Antoinette's execution. Anticipating recent feminist historians who have shown the ways in which Marie Antoinette served as a scapegoat, Staël points out that the Queen did not hold the power ascribed to her. Rather, she deserves sympathy as a suffering mother. In the Considerations on the Principal Events of the French Revolution, published posthumously, Staël writes that the Reign of Terror was a frightful crisis that was characterized by political fanaticism, which she compares to religious fanaticism, considering both as a structural and systemic division in the body politic. And I quote, "The will to dominate in those who are at the top of the wheel, the eagerness to make it turn in those who are at the bottom. This is the principle of all kinds of violence." In a 1791 essay, How Can We Determine What is the Opinion of the Majority of the Nation?, she sought to strengthen the moderate majority. And I quote again, "The majority of the nation wants and will always want equality and liberty. but also wants order and holds that the legal authority and the legitimate power of a king are necessary to maintain that order. By contrast, the two opposed extremes of Republicans and Royalists consider their positions to be mutually exclusive. Why does this bizarre contrast persist, she says? Cannot both these political positions be upheld? Stahl thus contributed actively through her political writings to advance a position of moderation that sutures the divisions within the body politic. Although she never explicitly refers to Christine de Pizan, in proposing ways to end the revolution and in composing two works on peace, external and internal, she appears to follow the example of Christine, who wrote the Book of Peace. Just as Christine, representing herself in tears, exhorted Queen Isabeau to intervene to prevent civil war, so Stahl implores her female readership to defend Marie Antoinette. And I quote, "O women of all countries, of all classes of society, listen to me with the emotion that I feel." In this way, both Christine de Pizan and Stahl affirmed the importance of emotion, especially compassion, as the basis of ethical political action, challenging the devaluing of emotion as feminized and in opposition to masculine reason. Unlike Christine de Pizan, however, whose patrons apparently valued her counsel, though not enough to end civil war, Stahl's work did not find a favorable reception from those in power. Napoleon accurately understood the political import of her novel Delphine and compelled her to leave France. The influential 19th century critic Sainte-Beuve, who praised Stahl as a political writer, likened her to a great Athenian orator, whose writings were so lively that her readers felt they were listening to her. In discussing her reflections on internal and external peace, Sainte-Beuve calls to mind the figure of Antigone. And I quote, "There is a classical inspiration in this figure of a young woman who comes forward to speak to a people, her feet on the smoking rubble. There is in addition a great political wisdom and an understanding of the real situation in the already mature counsels which escape from her passionate accent." In her chapter on Greek tragedy, Stahl herself refers to Antigone as a paragon of filial piety. Her father, to whom she was devoted, and whose works she edited, was Louis XVI's minister, Jacques Necker. She also affirms the role of literature in providing examples on how to live. Stahl understands literature to have a political significance and to be a form of political intervention, as she stated in the preface to On Literature, and I quote, "Some lives of Plutarch, a letter from Brutus to Cicero, the words of Cato of Utica in the language of Addison, the reflections that the hatred of tyranny inspired in Tacitus, raised a spirit that contemporary events have withered." In this statement, she expresses her understanding of the many literary forms political writing can take, as evident in the generically wide-ranging output of authors such as Christine and Cavendish. Just as Christine de Pizan and Stahl spoke from the position of a foreigner, Christine accompanied her father to the French court from Venice and called herself femme italienne, and Stahl was the wife of the Swiss ambassador to France, so the Englishwoman Helen Maria Williams wrote as an eyewitness of the French Revolution. Slide, please. In her series of letters from France, which are in fact political essays, Williams sought to counsel the English public on how to assess the French Revolution. Her writings not only found an enthusiastic readership in England, but also in France and the US. Like Stahl, and unlike Edmund Burke, who advanced his influential critique in Reflections on the Revolution in France, Williams considered the initial principles that animated the revolution to be salutary. However, she agreed with Stahl that the terror veered out of control from those initial principles. And like Stahl, she came under personal and gendered attack for her political views. Last slide, please. In The Human Condition, the 20th century political philosopher Hannah Arendt states that political action represents a new beginning, and Stahl's and Williams's unwavering pursuit and affirmation of the political nature of their authorship exemplifies their understanding of their writings as political action with implications for the future. Stahl and Williams both found the French Revolution a similarly enabling context for their political interventions, just as Christine de Pisan's political thought manifested itself in the context of the civil war between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, and yet Margaret Cavendish wrote on political subjects in the context of the English Civil Wars and the French Fronde. Although neither Stahl nor Williams were full-fledged citizens with political rights, Williams's self-designation as a cosmopolitan citizen of the world applies to Stahl as well. For all the writers I investigate in my book, the political disorder brought about by civil war enabled them not only to contribute to the political conversation of their day, but to look beyond the present, to reflect upon the fate of their writings and the political future, indicating an ambition that their writings will have an impact beyond their own lifetime. For example, true to her cosmopolitanism, Williams envisioned the political entity of Europe, united by liberty rather than conquest, and more specifically, a European Arab Pagiticus, a court to settle legal disputes between nations, which would have sounded fanciful to her contemporaries, but both of which did come to pass in the 20th century. Although many of these authors experienced periods of neglect, I hope my book demonstrates that they can still be heeded and reflected on with profit in the 20th century, during a time when political division and disorder loom large. Thank you.